I thought my biggest expense for my sister's wedding would be the $20,000 floral arrangement I paid for. I was wrong. 15 minutes before she walked down the aisle, my parents locked me in a church vestry, handed me a pen, and demanded the deed to my $900,000 home. I almost let their tears break me. Then I realized they were not asking. They were robbing me. 15 minutes. That was all the time left before the organist would start playing the bridal chorus. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the private vestry room at the back of the sprawling suburban church. I adjusted my silk tie, feeling a quiet sense of pride. Beyond the heavy wooden door, the church was packed with 300 guests. The sanctuary smelled faintly of fresh white roses and imported orchids. I knew exactly how much those flowers cost because I wrote the check for them. Chloe, my younger sister, wanted a fairy tale wedding, and my parents had proudly taken the public credit for funding the extravagant display. I did not mind letting them have the spotlight. I was 35, comfortably single, and my supply chain logistics consulting firm had just cleared its best financial quarter yet. I was happy to help my family behind the scenes. The heavy brass handle of the oak door clicked loudly. I turned around expecting to see a groomsman or the wedding coordinator telling me it was time to take my seat in the front pew. Instead, my father Richard stepped quickly into the room. My mother Susan followed right behind him. Before I could even offer a greeting, my father pushed the heavy door shut. I heard the unmistakable sound of the brass deadbolt sliding into place. The lock echoed sharply in the small, quiet room. I smiled confused, but trying to keep the mood light for the big day. I told them they looked great and asked if Chloe was ready for the ceremony. They did not smile back. My father's jaw was tight. His custom tuxedo looked a little too big on him, hanging off his shoulders in a way I had not noticed during the rehearsal dinner last night. My mother looked pale. She was clutching her silver designer bag to her chest like a shield, and she absolutely refused to meet my eyes. My father reached inside his suit jacket. He did not pull out a speech or a sentimental gift. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope and stepped right up into my personal space. He shoved it directly into my chest. He pressed it so hard against my ribs that I had to grab it with both hands just to keep it from falling to the hardwood floor. I looked down at the heavy paper and asked him what it was. He did not explain. He just told me to open it. I pulled back the flap and slid out a stack of crisp white papers. The bold black letters at the top of the first page hit me like a physical blow. Quit-claim deed. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them in the context of a wedding. Below the title was the address of my home, the home I had spent 4 years building from the ground up. The home that sat on 2 acres of prime suburban real estate, completely paid off, and currently valued at just over $900,000. Below the property description was a line for my signature, a line that would legally and completely transfer total ownership of my property to Richard and Susan. I looked up at my father, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I asked him if this was some kind of sick joke. I asked him why he brought real estate documents to a wedding. He did not blink. He told me it was no joke. He said he needed my house today. That was the exact cue for my mother. Susan suddenly burst into tears. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, dramatic sob that she had perfected over decades whenever she needed to manipulate a situation to get her way. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging deep into my jacket sleeve. She cried out that they were losing everything. She said my father's commercial supply business was completely bankrupt. The creditors were circling them like vultures. The bank was actively threatening to seize their primary home, their luxury cars, and what little remained of their retirement accounts. She looked up at me with wet, desperate eyes and said they had nowhere else to turn. They needed my house to survive. They needed me to sign the paper right now. I pulled my arm away from her grip. The initial shock was rapidly burning away, replaced by a cold, hard anger. I reminded them that I bought that land with my own money. I spent countless nights sleeping on an air mattress on the floor of a cheap studio apartment, pouring every single dollar I made from my logistics contracts into that property. I reminded them that while I was eating canned soup and working 80-hour weeks to build my future, they were busy paying for Chloe to take luxury vacations to Europe. They bought her a brand new car for her college graduation, while I took out student loans and paid my own way through state college. Now, 15 minutes before a wedding, I secretly helped pay for they were demanding the only major asset I owned. I tried to take a breath and reason with them. I offered to help them hire a top-tier bankruptcy lawyer. I offered to look at my father's corporate books and see if my logistics background could help restructure his failing supply chains. I even offered to cut them a check right then and there to cover their immediate living expenses for the next 6 months. I told them we could figure out a financial plan to save their house and keep them afloat. But I told them absolutely under no circumstances was I signing over the deed to my home. My mother stopped crying instantly. The tears dried up as if a switch had been flipped off behind her eyes. She glared at me and said money was not enough. She said a few months of living expenses would not save their reputation. She told me that their friends in the community could never know they were completely broke. She explained that if they moved into my sprawling custom-built home, it would look like a planned, luxurious retirement upgrade. It would save their social standing. She actually used those exact words. She wanted my $900,000 house to save her social standing at the country club. I laughed out loud because the absolute absurdity of the demand was suffocating. I told them they were out of their minds. I stepped around my father and reached for the brass deadbolt on the door. I told them this insane conversation was over and I was going to take my seat in this sanctuary. My father moved faster than I thought possible for a man his age. He slammed his hand against the heavy oak door, pushing it shut before I could turn the lock. He stepped squarely between me and the exit, planting his body like a barricade. The sad, desperate father act vanished completely. The muscles in his neck tightened, and his eyes turned completely cold and dead. He looked at me, not like a son, but like an obstacle standing in his way. He told me I was not going anywhere. He said he was not asking for a favor. He was collecting a debt. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh, quiet threat that sent a chill down my spine. He said they raised me. They fed me. They put a roof over my head for 18 years. Now it was time for me to pay them back with interest. He tapped a thick, heavy finger against the quitclaim deed still gripped in my hand. He told me I was going to sign that paper right now. If I refused, he would unlock the door, walk right up to the altar, and cancel the wedding immediately. He said he would tell Chloe her wealthy groom Bradley and all 300 guests sitting in those pews that I had maliciously sabotaged the family out of pure jealousy. He promised me he would ruin my name in front of everyone we knew. He looked at his luxury watch, looked back at me, and stated clearly that the wedding would not happen unless I signed my home away. I stood there staring at my father, my breath catching in my throat as his threat hung heavily in the small vestry room. I could not believe the sheer malice radiating from the man who raised me. The heavy wood of the locked door pressed against my back as I tried to process the reality of my own parents holding my sister's wedding hostage just to strip me of everything I had spent my adult life building. I reached around his massive frame, my hand gripping the cold brass handle of the deadbolt. I twisted it hard, determined to break away from this nightmare and walk out into the fresh air of the church corridor. But my father did not budge. He slammed his weight against the doorframe, using his forearm to pin my hand away from the lock. He glared down at me, his eyes wide and completely unyielding. I raised my voice, telling him to get out of my way and let me out. I told him he was crossing a line he could never cross back. I expected him to flinch or perhaps show a flicker of parental regret. Instead, he just let out a short, mocking laugh that sent a wave of nausea straight to my stomach. My mother stepped forward, then her tear-stained handkerchief discarded on a nearby vanity table. The desperate, weeping woman from 2 minutes ago was entirely gone. Her face looked sharp, calculated, and terrifyingly cold. She told me to stop making a scene and start listening to reason. She said I was being selfish, looking at only my own bank account, while the entire future of our family hung in the balance. I asked her how on earth defending my own property from theft was selfish. That was when she dropped the anchor that dragged this entire situation into a whole new depth of horror. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that the house was never just a backup plan to save their retirement. It was a dowry. She explained that Chloe's fiancé Bradley came from an incredibly old money high-status family in the state. His father was a prominent executive, and his mother was a high society matriarch who judged everyone by their zip code and asset portfolio. During the initial dinners between the two families, Bradley's parents had made it clear they expected their son to marry into equal wealth. They wanted assurance that Chloe would bring significant value to the union. My father leaned in his voice, a low, gravelly whisper against my ear. He admitted that to secure the match and finalize the engagement, he and my mother had made a formal promise to Bradley's family. They had told them that as a wedding gift, the newlyweds would be given a gorgeous, debt-free, custom-built estate situated on 2 pristine acres of land. They had explicitly described my $900,000 home to Bradley's parents, passing it off as a family asset that they owned and intended to sign over to Chloe on her wedding day. I felt the room tilt beneath my feet. The oxygen seemed to leave the vestry completely. I looked from my father's stony face to my mother's cold, expectant gaze. I asked them how they could possibly promise away something that did not belong to them. I asked if they had lost their minds lying to a wealthy family and using my blood, sweat, and tears as a chip to buy Chloe a ticket into high society. My mother shrugged her shoulders casually, as if they had merely borrowed a lawnmower without asking. She said they did what any loving parents would do to ensure their daughter's happiness. She told me that Bradley's family already had the moving truck scheduled for next week. They had already bragged to all their upper-class friends about the stunning estate their son was inheriting as a marital gift. If the deed was not delivered to Bradley's father at the reception tonight, the truth would come out. The wedding would be declared a sham. Bradley's family would call off the union immediately due to fraud, and our family would be completely blacklisted from every social circle in the city. The disgust inside me turned into a burning fire. I reached into my front pants pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers were shaking with a mix of rage and adrenaline. I told them I was calling Chloe right that second. I told them I refused to believe my sister would allow our parents to rob her own brother just so she could pretend to be a wealthy socialite. I told them Chloe loved me and she would put a stop to this insanity the moment she heard what they were doing to me in this locked room. Before the phone could even finish unlocking, my mother lunged forward with a speed that caught me completely off guard. She snatched the device right out of my hand, her sharp fingernails scraping against my palm. She stepped back, clutching my phone tightly against her chest. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh that sounded completely unhinged. She told me I was incredibly naive. She asked me who I thought came up with the entire idea in the first place. The world went dead silent around me. I stared at my mother, my voice barely a whisper, as I asked her what she meant. She took a step closer, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. She told me that Chloe was the one who suggested it. She revealed that 6 months ago, when Bradley's parents began pressuring them about Chloe's financial background, Chloe had panicked. She knew our father's business was failing, and she knew she had nothing to offer. So Chloe told Bradley and his parents that she owned a massive, beautiful home that her brother was currently managing for her. Chloe was the one who handed our parents the property details. Chloe was the one who insisted that Harrison had plenty of money, that Harrison could easily buy another house, and that Harrison owed it to her to ensure her wedding day was absolutely perfect. My father nodded in agreement, his expression grim. He told me that Chloe's entire future happiness depended on my signature today. He said Bradley was standing in the groom's room right now, fully aware that the deed was supposed to be signed before the vows. He confirmed that Bradley had explicitly stated that if the signed quitclaim deed was not in his hands before they cut the cake, he would file for an immediate annulment and leave Chloe standing at the altar in front of all 300 guests. I leaned against the wall, the betrayal cutting through me like a physical blade. My own sister, the girl I had protected, the girl whose college textbooks I paid for, had targeted my home like a vulture. She had weaponized our parents' desperation and greed to steal the single greatest achievement of my life. Also, she could play make-believe with an old money family. They had all sat at the rehearsal dinner last night, smiling at me, clinking their champagne glasses while secretly planning to ambush me in a locked room less than 24 hours later. I looked at my parents, my voice hardening into a tone I had never used with them before. I told them they were monsters. I told them that if Bradley walked out, then let him walk. If Chloe's entire relationship was built on a multi-$100,000 lie, then she deserved to have it blow up in her face. I demanded my phone back, telling them that I was going to walk out of this church, drive back to my beautiful home, and completely cut every single one of them out of my life forever. My father did not step away from the door. Instead, his face contorted into a mask of pure fury. He stepped forward until his chest was pressing against mine, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. He told me that if I walked out that door without signing, he would make sure I regretted it for the rest of my days. He reiterated his threat, promising that he would walk straight into the main sanctuary, grab the microphone from the altar, and announce to the entire community that I was a bitter, resentful sociopath who had ruined his sister's life out of sheer spite. He said he would tell my clients, my business partners, and everyone we knew that I was a fraud who stole from his own family. My mother chimed in, her voice sharp and piercing. She said they would make sure I was completely isolated. She said no one would ever believe my side of the story because they would all see a heartbroken bride weeping at the altar because her jealous older brother refused to support her. They were completely prepared to sacrifice my reputation, my business, and my mental health just to secure a wealthy marriage for their golden child. The psychological pressure was suffocating, closing in on me like the walls of a trash compactor. I felt completely trapped, cornered by the very people who were supposed to protect me from the world. Suddenly, a deep, resonant vibration shook the floorboards beneath our feet. The massive pipe organ in the main sanctuary began to play. The opening notes of the wedding march echoed through the heavy stone walls of the church, signaling to everyone that the ceremony was officially beginning. The guests were taking their seats. The bridal party was lining up. The clock had officially run out. My mother opened her silver designer bag. She did not pull out a tissue or a compact. She pulled out a heavy, gleaming luxury fountain pen, the very one I had gifted my father for his 60th birthday. She stepped forward, her eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying intensity. She grabbed my right hand, prying my fingers open, and shoved the cold metal pen directly into my palm. She forced my fingers to wrap around the casing, her grip iron tight. She pushed the stack of quitclaim papers back into my chest, commanding me to sign it now or face total ruin before the music stopped playing. The heavy oak door of the vestry finally swung open, pulling the suffocating tension of that small room out into the brightly lit church corridor. The cool air-conditioned breeze hit my face, but my lungs refused to expand. I could not draw a full breath. My mother immediately stepped into my space and looped her arm tightly through my right arm. Her grip was not affectionate. Her fingers clamped down on my bicep like a steel vise, her manicured nails digging sharply through the wool of my suit jacket. To any wedding coordinator or passing guest, she looked exactly like a proud, emotional mother holding onto her successful son for support. To me, she felt like a prison guard marching a condemned man from his holding cell directly to the gallows. The thick stack of the quitclaim deed rested inside my inner breast pocket. It felt like a block of solid lead pressing directly against my heart. The cold, polished metal of the luxury fountain pen my mother had forced into my palm was now shoved deep into my pants pocket, scraping against my leg with every step we took. The massive pipe organ in the main sanctuary was roaring now, vibrating forcefully through the polished stone floor and shaking my heavy legs. We walked slowly past the smiling wedding coordinator, a young woman holding a clipboard who leaned in and whispered that our family looked absolutely picture-perfect today. I stared at her cheerful face. I wanted to scream at her to call the police. I wanted to tell her that an extortion plot was unfolding right in front of her eyes, but I kept my mouth shut. My father was walking exactly half a step behind my left shoulder. I could hear his heavy leather dress shoes scuffing rhythmically against the floorboards. I could feel his cold, furious eyes boring into the back of my neck, silently promising to destroy my entire personal and professional life if I made a single wrong move or uttered a single word of defiance. We reached the towering double doors that led into the main sanctuary. Two young ushers in matching tuxedos smiled warmly and pulled the heavy brass handles in unison. The doors swung wide, and a massive wall of bright light, intense floral perfumes, and hundreds of turning faces washed over me instantly. The walk down the grand center aisle felt like stepping into a slow, waking nightmare. There were over 300 guests seated in the long, polished wooden pews that stretched all the way to the altar. Every single one of them turned their heads. Every single one of them was smiling at us. Camera flashes began to explode from the edges of the aisle, blinding me temporarily with harsh white light. These people thought they were witnessing a beautiful traditional display of family unity and love. They had absolutely no idea. They were actively participating in a hostage situation. I forced the corners of my mouth to lift into a rigid fake smile because the alternative was a public execution of my character. My father had made his terms crystal clear. If I caused a scene, he would tell this entire room that I was a deranged, jealous brother trying to ruin my sister's perfect day. With every slow, agonizing step forward, a different memory of my past sacrifices flashed through my mind, mocking the very foundation of my life. The sheer injustice of the demand burned a hole through my chest. I remembered the brutally sweltering summers I spent working double shifts at a suffocating supply warehouse just to save enough money for the initial down payment on my property. I remembered the endless nights sitting at a cheap folding table cold, calling logistics clients until my throat bled, desperate to build my consulting firm from absolutely nothing. I did not take a single vacation for 7 straight years. Not one. I ate cheap canned soup and drove a rusted, unreliable sedan with a broken heater through freezing winters so I could afford the high-quality building materials required to construct my dream house. Every single dollar I earned, every drop of sweat I poured out went directly into creating a secure, completely debt-free future for myself. I built my $900,000 estate with my own 2 bare hands and my own unbroken willpower. And while I was exhausting my body and completely isolating my mind to build that future, my parents were busy blindly financing Chloe's extravagant fantasy life. As I smiled at an older aunt, sitting in the 3rd row, I vividly remembered my mother happily signing a massive check for Chloe to spend an entire month lounging in luxury villas in Italy, a trip meant to console her right after she voluntarily dropped out of her expensive graduate program. As another camera flashed in my face, I remembered my father buying Chloe a brand new custom-ordered convertible simply because she complained that her previous luxury vehicle was not the exact shade of pearl white she desired. They never asked my sister to work a single day for anything she owned. They never asked her to build anything of lasting value. They simply handed her the world on a silver platter, funding her entitlement with money they clearly did not have. Now their financial house of cards had completely collapsed, and they were literally ripping the concrete foundation of my life out from under me just to maintain her pathetic illusions of grandeur. The suffocating perfume of the white roses lining the aisle made my stomach turn. The grand aisle seemed to stretch out for miles, an endless gauntlet of smiling faces and judging eyes. But eventually, we reached the very front row. The first long pew on the right side was reserved entirely for our immediate family. Across the wide carpeted aisle, sitting in the place of absolute highest honor, was Bradley's family. I looked over and saw Bradley's father for the first time today. He was a stern, incredibly intimidating-looking man with perfectly styled silver hair. He was wearing an impeccably tailored dark custom suit that undoubtedly cost more than the first car I ever owned. He sat with perfect, rigid posture, projecting a terrifying aura of immense generational wealth and corporate power. His wife sat directly beside him, absolutely dripping in authentic diamonds, looking mildly bored by the entire religious spectacle. These were the powerful, status-obsessed people my parents were so deeply terrified of offending. These were the elite socialites who demanded my home as a mandatory entry fee for their son's hand in marriage. They sat there with total confidence, fully believing that my life's work was nothing more than a wedding favor, being freely handed over to their golden child. I carefully escorted my mother into the polished wooden pew. She slid in smoothly, gracefully smoothing out the wrinkles in her incredibly expensive silk dress. She immediately offered a radiant, perfectly rehearsed smile to the wealthy guest sitting directly behind us. I sat down heavily next to her. My legs felt completely numb, devoid of all blood and energy. My father immediately took the seat directly on my left side, effectively trapping my body between the two of them. There was no physical way out. The pastor stood patiently at the elevated altar, looking down at our family with a warm, welcoming, and entirely ignorant expression. The massive pipe organ swelled suddenly, the musician pressing down on the pedals to reach a loud, triumphant crescendo. It was the universal signal for the imminent arrival of the bride. Under the heavy, booming cover of the dramatic music, my father leaned his massive shoulder aggressively against mine. He leaned his head over until his mouth was barely an inch from my left ear. He did not turn his head to look at me. He kept his eyes locked firmly forward on the glowing stained glass windows above the altar, perfectly maintaining his flawless public facade of the proud patriarch. But his voice cut through the loud organ music like a jagged, rusty razor blade. He whispered that Bradley's father was expecting to see the physical signed deed the very second we arrived at the reception hall doors. He stated clearly, his tone dripping with absolute finality, that if the legal document was not perfectly signed and ready to be handed over before the champagne was poured, the wealthy old man sitting 10 feet across the aisle would stand up in front of everyone. My father warned me that Bradley's father would not hesitate to announce the financial fraud to the entire room, humiliate our family beyond repair, and force his son to file for an immediate, highly publicized annulment. My father took a slow breath and told me I had exactly 3 minutes to pull the paper out of my jacket and sign my name before Chloe started her march down the aisle. He told me that if I ruined this day, I would not have a family, a business, or a reputation left by tomorrow morning. The booming notes of the pipe organ shifted abruptly, transitioning smoothly into the iconic soaring chords of the traditional bridal chorus. The entire congregation rose to their feet in perfect unison. The loud rustling of expensive fabrics and the excited murmurs of anticipation filled the massive vaulted room. I stood up with them, my body moving completely on pure detached autopilot. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs, I thought my chest might actually crack open. I was completely trapped in a suffocating cage of rising panic and overwhelming, crushing grief. I looked up at the towering stained glass windows, desperately begging silently for some kind of divine intervention, for some massive event to stop the clock. But all I saw was dead-colored glass. I looked down at my mother. She was staring straight ahead toward the back doors, her face set into a mask of absolute ruthless determination. I looked at my father. He casually reached over and subtly tapped his thick index finger against the outside of my suit jacket, right over the spot where the folded deed rested over my heart. Decades of relentless emotional conditioning finally crashed down on my shoulders. Decades of being subtly taught that my only real value as a human being was what I could financially provide for this family broke through my mental defenses. The intense psychological pressure of 300 watching eyes combined with the catastrophic threats to my professional livelihood was simply too much weight for one man to fight against in a single moment. I felt entirely alone. I felt utterly, completely defeated by the very people who had brought me into this world and promised to protect me. Hot, bitter tears of profound betrayal suddenly welled up in my eyes, severely blurring my vision of the altar. My hands began to shake violently. Slowly feeling as though I was moving underwater, I reached my trembling right hand inside my breast pocket. I pulled out the crisp, heavy fold of the quitclaim deed. I reached into my pants pocket and pulled out the cold, heavy fountain pen. I kept my movements incredibly small and tight against my waist, hiding the legal documents entirely below the top edge of the wooden pew so the guests behind me could not see my surrender. I unfolded the thick white paper, exposing the final signature line at the bottom of the page. It was a single blank black line that would legally erase 4 years of my grueling hard work and hand my entire financial future over to people who actively despised me. I pressed my thumb down hard against the top of the pen. The loud, sharp, metallic click of the mechanism engaging echoed in my own ears, sounding exactly like the heavy steel door of a prison cell slamming shut forever. I slowly lowered the golden nib toward the stark white paper. A single hot tear slipped down my cheek, falling silently through the air and splashing heavily onto the bottom corner of the deed. Just as the sharp ink-filled tip of the pen touched the fiber of the paper in the pew, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church slammed open with explosive force, echoing loudly over the pastor's voice. The explosive sound of the heavy oak doors slamming against the stone walls of the vestibule shattered the majestic organ music. The loud bang echoed through the vaulted ceiling like a gunshot. Every single person in the sanctuary gasped. 300 heads whipped around in perfect unison to look toward the back of the church. I froze. The golden nib of the fountain pen was resting exactly a millimeter above the signature line of the quitclaim deed. My trembling hand stopped completely. I did not look back. I just stared at the blank white paper resting on my lap, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The organist, severely startled by the violent noise, missed a pedal. A harsh, discordant chord blasted through the massive pipes before the music ground to a complete and sudden halt. The sudden silence in the massive room was absolute and suffocating. No one moved. No one breathed. Slowly, I lifted my eyes from the legal document and turned my head to look over my left shoulder. Standing perfectly centered in the grand doorway was not a late guest. It was not a crying child. It was Mitchell. Mitchell was my lead corporate attorney, a man who charged $800 an hour to ruthlessly dismantle rival logistics companies in the boardroom. He was dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal gray suit. He held a thick, tightly packed leather briefcase in his left hand. In his right hand, he carried two thick manila folders. His face was entirely devoid of emotion. He looked like a predator stepping into a cage full of very slow, very confused prey. Mitchell did not hesitate. He stepped onto the plush white aisle runner and began walking directly toward the altar. His pace was measured, calm, and terrifyingly deliberate. His leather dress shoes clicked sharply against the polished stone floor where the carpet did not reach. The sound cut through the dead silence of the sanctuary like a ticking clock. As he passed the back pews, the wealthy guests began to murmur. The quiet whispers swelled into a wave of confused chatter. People were craning their necks trying to understand why a man looking like a corporate executioner was interrupting the most anticipated social event of the season. I looked over at the bridal party standing near the front. My sister Chloe was standing just outside the vestibule, partially visible through the side arches. Her perfect angelic smile had completely vanished. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She knew exactly who Mitchell was. I had introduced them at a family dinner 3 years ago when Mitchell helped me structure the legal framework for my new company. She knew Mitchell was not here to celebrate. At the altar, the pastor gripped his leather-bound Bible tightly, his mouth hanging open in total confusion. He stepped forward, raising his free hand, unsure if he should call for security or offer a blessing. Mitchell kept walking. He did not look at the pastor. He did not look at the wealthy socialites gasping in the pews. He did not look at my mother, who was sitting next to me with her face drained of all blood, looking as though she was about to faint. Mitchell kept his cold, piercing eyes locked entirely on me. He reached the very front row. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from where my father and I were sitting. He looked down at my lap. He saw the quitclaim deed resting on my thigh. He saw the luxury fountain pen gripped tightly in my trembling fingers. The tear I had shed just moments before was still glistening on the corner of the heavy paper. Mitchell did not yell. He did not raise his voice to compete with the rising murmurs of the crowd. He spoke in a perfectly calm, deeply authoritative tone that carried flawlessly across the silent church. Every single word was sharp, clear, and absolute. "Do not sign that paper," Mitchell said. I stared at him, my throat completely tight. I could not form a single word. The psychological weight of the last 20 minutes was sitting so heavily on my chest that I simply could not breathe. Mitchell stepped 1 inch closer, his voice dropping an octave but somehow projecting even further into the massive room. "Harrison, put the pen down right now. If you sign that document, it makes you an accomplice to federal fraud." The word fraud dropped into the sanctuary like a live grenade. The confused whispers of the congregation instantly vanished, replaced by a collective horrified gasp. On the other side of the aisle, Bradley's father sat up perfectly straight, his dark eyes snapping onto Mitchell with sudden, intense scrutiny. The wealthy patriarch recognized the tone of a high-stakes corporate lawyer. His wife clutched her diamond necklace, looking wildly between her son at the altar and the stranger standing in the aisle. Next to me, my father completely lost his mind. The carefully constructed facade of the proud, loving family patriarch shattered into a million jagged pieces. His face turned a dark, furious shade of red. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his tight white collar. He leaped up from the wooden pew with such violent force that he knocked the heavy hymnal book off the rack in front of him. The book slammed onto the stone floor, the loud smack echoing through the room. My father pointed a trembling, thick finger directly at Mitchell's face. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice entirely devoid of the polished charm he used to manipulate his country club friends. He demanded to know what Mitchell was doing here. He screamed that this was a private, closed ceremony and that Mitchell was trespassing. He turned his furious gaze toward the back of the church and began waving his arms wildly. He yelled for the ushers. He ordered them to get down here right this second and physically remove this man from the building. He shouted that Mitchell was a lunatic trying to ruin a sacred family moment out of pure spite. Two young ushers, college-aged boys, in matching tuxedos, who were completely out of their depth, began nervously jogging down the center aisle. They looked terrified. They did not want to touch Mitchell. They did not want to be involved in this chaotic scene. As they closed in, my father stepped out of the pew, aggressively blocking Mitchell's path, trying to use his massive frame to physically intimidate the attorney. My father leaned forward, lowering his voice into a vicious guttural snarl meant only for Mitchell and me. He threatened to sue Mitchell for every single dime he owned. He threatened to have him disbarred by Monday morning. He said Mitchell was making the biggest mistake of his professional career. Mitchell did not even blink. He did not step back. He simply adjusted his grip on his leather briefcase. He looked at my father with the exact same expression a person uses when scraping dirt off the bottom of an expensive shoe. With a swift, incredibly smooth motion, Mitchell sidestepped my father completely. He moved with an effortless agility that left my father stumbling slightly forward, grasping at empty air. Mitchell ignored the two approaching ushers entirely. He walked right past them, stepping smoothly up the short carpeted stairs that led directly to the elevated altar. The pastor took a frightened step backward, holding his Bible up as if to ward off an evil spirit. He stammered, asking Mitchell to please respect the sanctity of the sanctuary. He said they were in the middle of a holy sacrament. He asked Mitchell to wait outside until the service concluded. Mitchell stopped right in front of the pastor. His demeanor softened slightly, showing a trace of professional respect for the clergyman, but his mission remained absolutely unyielding. Mitchell reached into his right hand and held out the first thick manila folder. He extended it toward the confused pastor. He told the pastor that he sincerely apologized for the disruption to his church. He said he had no desire to disrespect the holy venue, but he stated firmly that the pastor needed to look at the documents inside that folder before he facilitated a marriage ceremony today. The pastor nervously reached out and took the folder. His hands were shaking. He opened the flap and stared down at the dense legal text printed on the top page. I could not see what the paper said from where I was sitting, but I saw the color completely drain from the pastor's face. The holy man looked up, his eyes wide with genuine horror, and he took another slow step backward away from the center of the altar. He closed the folder quickly, as if the paper inside was burning his fingers. Mitchell did not wait for the pastor to speak. He pivoted sharply on his heel and turned his attention directly to the groom. Bradley was standing perfectly still next to the altar steps. His expensive custom tuxedo looked flawless, but his posture was completely rigid. He looked like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming truck. His perfect, wealthy smile was gone. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. He was staring at the second manila folder in Mitchell's hand with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked absolutely sick to his stomach. Mitchell walked slowly toward the groom. The silence in the church was so profound that I could hear the fabric of Mitchell's suit brushing against itself as he moved. He stopped exactly 1 foot away from Bradley. Mitchell held the second folder out, pressing it firmly against Bradley's chest, until the groom had no choice but to reach up and take it. Mitchell did not whisper this time. He spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring that Bradley's wealthy parents sitting in the front row could hear every single syllable. Mitchell told Bradley that he believed this folder belonged to him. He said it contained a complete certified paper trail of a highly illegal transaction. He said it contained the exact dates, the exact bank routing numbers, and the exact digital signatures that tied Bradley directly to the crime. Mitchell told the groom that he highly recommended reading it before he made any more permanent life decisions today. Bradley took the folder. His hands were shaking so violently that the papers inside rattled against the cardboard cover. He did not open it. He just stared at Mitchell, completely paralyzed by fear. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat, but he did not say a single word in his own defense. From the front pew, Bradley's father stood up. The powerful corporate executive had seen enough. He demanded to know what was going on. He demanded to know what those papers were and why his son was being accused of fraud in the middle of a church. His booming voice echoed off the stone walls, carrying the weight of a man who was used to giving orders and having them instantly obeyed. He pointed at Mitchell and told him he had exactly 10 seconds to explain himself before he called his own legal team to destroy him. My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail from the pew next to me. She threw her hands over her face, attempting to start her weeping routine again to garner sympathy from the wealthy guests. But the atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. No one was looking at her with pity. Every single eye in the sanctuary was locked intensely onto Mitchell. The guests were leaning forward, completely captivated by the unfolding legal drama. The fake picture-perfect wedding had been entirely stripped away, revealing the ugly, rotting truth underneath. I sat in the pew, still holding the blank quitclaim deed. I looked down at my hands. The violent trembling had stopped entirely. The suffocating weight that had been crushing my chest for the last 20 minutes was completely gone. Mitchell had stepped into the absolute darkest moment of my life and shattered the chains my parents had wrapped around me. I reached my right hand over, placed the cap firmly back onto the luxury fountain pen, and shoved it deep into my pocket. I folded the blank legal document in half and set it down on the wooden bench beside me. I was not signing anything. I was finally free. Mitchell turned away from the groom. He walked to the exact center of the altar, standing in the spot where my sister and her fiancé were supposed to exchange their eternal vows. He looked out over the sea of shocked faces in the pews. He looked at the wealthy socialites on the left. He looked at our confused family friends on the right. Finally, he looked directly at my furious father, who was still being cautiously held back by the two terrified ushers in the center aisle. Mitchell raised his voice, ensuring his words reached the very back row of the massive church. He addressed the entire congregation. He told them that he deeply apologized for the severe interruption to their afternoon. He acknowledged that many of them had traveled a long way to celebrate what was supposed to be a joyous occasion. He said it gave him absolutely no pleasure to ruin a wedding day. But then Mitchell's face hardened. His eyes swept across the silent crowd, locking the entire room into his unwavering authority. He stated that he was a sworn officer of the court. He stated that he had discovered evidence of a massive financial crime early this morning. He told the 300 guests sitting in the pews that he was legally and ethically obligated to halt this ceremony immediately. He told them he had to stop the vows right now, not out of malice, but to prevent a massive federal felony from being permanently finalized at this altar today. Mitchell stood absolutely still at the center of the altar. The heavy silence in the massive church was thick enough to choke on. 300 wealthy guests were holding their breath, waiting for the corporate lawyer to explain why he had just accused my family of a federal felony. Bradley's father, the imposing executive sitting in the front row, remained standing. His face was a mask of furious authority. He pointed a rigid finger at Mitchell and demanded a full explanation immediately. He shouted that his family name was not something to be dragged through the mud in a public venue. Mitchell did not flinch at the threat. He slowly lowered the empty hand that had just delivered the devastating manila folders. He turned his sharp, calculating gaze directly to the wealthy patriarch. Mitchell stated clearly that he had no interest in mud, only in the law. He then turned his body slightly so his voice would project across the entire congregation. Mitchell began his explanation by taking everyone back exactly 6 months. He spoke loudly, his voice echoing perfectly off the vaulted stone ceilings. He reminded me and informed the silent crowd of my extended corporate contract in Munich, Germany. I had spent 8 grueling weeks in Europe over the winter. I was completely consumed by a massive international supply chain deal. I worked 18-hour days, navigating complex logistics networks across multiple time zones. I was entirely disconnected from my personal mail, my local banking, and my daily life back home. I remembered calling my parents from a lonely hotel room during that trip, checking in on them and asking how Chloe's wedding planning was coming along. My father had sounded so incredibly proud of me on those phone calls. He had praised my work ethic. He had told me to stay focused and not to worry about a single thing happening back in the States. Mitchell shattered that memory into a million jagged pieces. He told the congregation that while I was isolated thousands of miles away, working myself to the bone to secure my future, my father was busy executing a calculated, premeditated crime. Mitchell reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper encased in a clear plastic sleeve. He held it up for the entire room to see. He announced that during my second week in Germany, my father, Richard, had walked into a local notary office with a completely fabricated legal document. It was a comprehensive general power of attorney. Mitchell explained that the document was designed to grant my father total unrestricted financial control over all of my personal and business assets. The signature at the bottom of the page claiming to be mine was a masterful, deliberate forgery. I sat frozen in the hard wooden pew. My mind could barely process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. The demand in the vestry room for the quitclaim deed was a sudden, violent extortion. But this forgery was something entirely different. This was cold calculated and executed months in advance. My own father had systematically stolen my identity while smiling and praising me over international phone calls. I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me. The man who taught me how to ride a bike, the man who stood on the sidelines of my childhood baseball games, had sat at a desk and practiced forging my name so he could rob me blind. Mitchell did not let the crowd recover from the shock. He continued building the terrible picture, layer by layer. He explained that my father did not forge this document just to access my checking account or pay off a few minor credit card debts. He used my stolen identity to target the single most valuable asset I had ever built. Mitchell pointed directly at me, sitting silently in the pew. He told the 300 guests that I owned a completely debt-free custom-built estate valued at over $900,000. He told them how I had poured 4 years of my life and every penny of my consulting profits into that property. Then Mitchell dropped the hammer. He revealed that my father had taken the forged power of attorney to a major commercial bank and used it to take out a massive $500,000 secondary loan against my home. The gasps from the congregation were loud and immediate. People began whispering frantically, completely horrified by the scale of the theft. I felt the blood completely drain from my face. $500,000. My father had secretly extracted $500,000 in pure cash, placing a massive, crippling lien on the home I had sacrificed everything to build. Mitchell explained that my father was desperate. His commercial supply business was rapidly spiraling into total bankruptcy, and he needed a massive injection of cash to keep his company afloat and to continue funding the illusion of immense wealth for Chloe's upcoming high society wedding. He stole my equity to pay for his failing reputation. But Mitchell raised his hand, silencing the murmuring crowd. He said the story was not over. He explained the strict realities of corporate banking. He stated that taking out a $500,000 loan against a fully paid off property using a power of attorney, while the primary owner is supposedly unreachable overseas, is a massive security risk. Any competent financial institution would immediately flag that transaction. The underwriting department should have frozen the application. They should have demanded direct verbal confirmation from me. The bank should have triggered a dozen internal fraud alerts before a single dollar was ever released into my father's bank account. Mitchell looked out over the crowd and asked the obvious question. How did my father bypass the intense security protocols of a major commercial bank? Mitchell paused, letting the heavy question hang in the air. Then he turned his body completely away from my father and looked directly at the groom. Bradley was standing by the altar steps, looking absolutely catastrophic. The expensive manila folder Mitchell had handed him moments ago was shaking violently in his hands. Bradley's perfectly styled hair seemed to droop. His flawless posture had completely collapsed. Mitchell looked at Bradley's furious father in the front row and asked him a simple question. He asked the patriarch if he knew what his son did for a living. The older man looked confused, stating proudly that his son was a senior commercial loan officer at one of the largest and most respected financial institutions in the state. Mitchell nodded slowly. He pointed a long, steady finger directly at Bradley. He announced to the entire church that Bradley was the exact loan officer who processed, approved, and personally pushed through my father's fraudulent $500,000 loan. The church erupted. It was no longer just polite murmuring. It was absolute chaos. Bradley's mother let out a shrill, piercing scream of disbelief, dropping her expensive clutch purse onto the floor. Bradley's father staggered backward as if he had been physically punched in the chest, staring at his son with wide, horrified eyes. The puzzle pieces aggressively slammed together in my mind, forming a terrifying picture of pure greed. The narrative of my home being a generous wedding gift was a complete and utter lie. It was a massive smokescreen. Chloe and my parents had not just promised my house to Bradley's family to secure a wealthy marriage. Bradley was actively involved in the crime. Bradley knew exactly what my father was doing. He needed the stolen cash to fund the extravagant, careless lifestyle Chloe demanded, and my father needed the cash to save his sinking business. They had formed a criminal conspiracy. My father provided the forged legal documents, and Bradley severely abused his banking credentials to completely bypass the underwriting security protocols. Bradley illegally authorized a massive cash payout against my property without ever lifting a finger to contact me. I looked at my sister Chloe standing near the vestibule. She was shaking her head violently, tears streaming down her face, her perfect makeup running in dark streaks. But she did not look confused. She looked terrified. She knew the entire time that her wedding was financed by stolen money. She knew her fiancé and her father were criminals. They had all sat together at the rehearsal dinner last night, raising expensive glasses of champagne, laughing and celebrating, while knowing they had secretly tied a $500,000 anchor around my neck. Mitchell raised his voice, shouting over the chaotic noise of the sanctuary. He commanded everyone to listen to the final, most crucial piece of the puzzle. He demanded silence, and his sheer authority forced the room to quiet down. Mitchell explained the precise mechanics of financial crime. He stated that a fraudulent loan is completely invisible to the world as long as the banking regulators do not look too closely. But banking regulations are incredibly strict, and they are unavoidable. Mitchell revealed the terrifying reality of their situation. He announced that Bradley's specific branch of the bank was scheduled for a massive comprehensive federal regulatory audit starting first thing Monday morning. The word audit hit Bradley like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to reach out and grab the wooden railing of the altar steps just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Mitchell explained that the federal auditors were going to meticulously review every single high-value commercial loan approved in the last fiscal year. They were going to look at the paperwork. When they reached my father's $500,000 file, they would instantly see the glaring irregularities. The auditors would immediately contact me, the primary property owner, to verify the massive debt against my home. The forgery would be exposed the very second they called my phone. The entire criminal conspiracy would unravel in a matter of hours. Mitchell looked directly at my father, who was now leaning heavily against the wooden pew, hyperventilating loudly, his face entirely drained of color. Then Mitchell looked back at the groom, who was staring at the floor completely broken. Mitchell told the congregation the absolute terrifying truth behind this beautiful wedding day. He explained that the only way Bradley and my father could possibly survive the Monday morning federal audit was if the forged loan was suddenly backed by legitimate, undisputed ownership of the property. If my father could force me into that locked vestry room today, if he could emotionally blackmail me into signing that quitclaim deed transferring the legal title of my home completely into his name, before the weekend ended, the bank auditors would be satisfied. On Monday morning, the regulators would see that the man who took out the massive loan also legally owned the house. The red flags would completely disappear. The fraud would be permanently and legally buried under my signature. The theft of my entire life's work would be perfectly clean. Mitchell pointed his finger aggressively toward the altar, his voice ringing with absolute finality. He stated clearly that this entire lavish wedding was nothing more than a desperate ticking clock. He told the horrified guests that if my family did not force me to sign that legal paper before the reception ended tonight, federal regulators would inevitably discover the missing $500,000 on Monday morning. He stared directly at the groom and the father of the bride, promising them both that when the sun rose on Monday, the audit would send them straight to federal prison. The romantic illusion of the beautiful church ceremony dissolved instantly. The massive sanctuary, completely decorated with imported white roses and silk ribbons, no longer felt like a place of holy matrimony. It felt like a brightly lit crime scene. Mitchell had just exposed a massive federal felony to 300 wealthy guests. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed his declaration hung in the air for only a few seconds before the absolute chaos of reality crashed down upon the altar. Bradley stood frozen at the front of the church. The thick manila folder Mitchell had shoved into his chest was shaking so violently that the papers inside were rattling audibly. The groom looked entirely broken. His perfect, wealthy smile was completely gone. His expensive custom tuxedo suddenly looked like a prison uniform. He stared down at the documents, fully comprehending that his high society life, his lucrative career, and his absolute freedom were completely over. The bank audit on Monday morning was a guaranteed death sentence. There was no escaping the paper trail he had foolishly created. I watched him from my seat in the front pew. I expected him to turn around and look for my sister. I expected the groom to drop the folder rush over to his beautiful bride and offer some kind of tearful apology. I expected him to try and comfort the woman he was supposed to pledge his life to in a matter of minutes, but Bradley did not even look in Chloe's direction. He did not care about her broken heart or her ruined wedding day. He only cared about saving his own skin. Bradley suddenly snapped. The overwhelming terror in his eyes transformed rapidly into pure, unadulterated rage. He reached up with a violently shaking hand and grabbed the expensive white floral boutonniere pinned to his tuxedo lapel. He ripped the flowers off his chest with such force that the metal pin tore a jagged hole straight through the custom silk fabric. He threw the crushed flowers violently onto the polished stone floor. He did not yell at Mitchell. He did not yell at the wealthy guest staring at him. Bradley turned his entire body away from the altar and locked his furious eyes directly onto my father. Bradley pointed a shaking finger at Richard and screamed at the top of his lungs. His voice was completely devoid of his usual polished country club charm. It was harsh, shrill, and entirely desperate. He screamed that Richard had lied to him. He shouted across the silent church that Richard had looked him dead in the eye and promised him a completely clean title to the property. He yelled that Richard had sworn the forged power of attorney was just a temporary formality because I was stuck in Germany. My father leaped out of the wooden pew. His face flushed a dark, dangerous shade of purple. He raised his hands desperately, trying to quiet the groom down. He hissed loudly, begging Bradley to lower his voice and stop talking in front of the massive crowd. He tried to maintain the pathetic illusion that this could somehow still be fixed quietly. But Bradley was completely unhinged. The cornered rat was fighting back, and he did not care who he took down with him. Bradley took a heavy step toward the pews, ignoring the gasps from the wealthy congregation. He screamed that my father had promised him I would sign the quitclaim deed the moment I returned from Europe. He yelled that he only bypassed the bank security protocols because my father had absolutely guaranteed the $500,000 loan would be permanently secured by my property today. Bradley looked at his own horrified parents sitting in the front row, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He cried out that he was going to lose his commercial banking license. He screamed that he was going to federal prison because he trusted a bankrupt, desperate liar. The groom completely exposed the depth of their dirty secret deal. There was no honor among these thieves. The very second the criminal conspiracy was brought into the light, they instantly turned on each other. My father shouted back, his voice booming through the church. He blamed Bradley, screaming that Bradley was the banking professional who should have known how to hide the paper trail properly. They stood there, two men wearing expensive tuxedos in a house of worship, viciously fighting over who was responsible for stealing my life savings. Suddenly, a loud, frantic rustling of heavy silk fabric echoed from the side archway. Chloe burst out from the vestibule and ran blindly down the center aisle. Her massive, extravagant white wedding gown dragged heavily across the floor. Her perfect, professionally styled hair was beginning to fall apart. Her expensive makeup was completely ruined, dark streaks of mascara running down her pale cheeks. I looked at my sister, genuinely expecting her to run up to the altar and slap Bradley across the face. I expected her to scream at our father for ruining her life with a massive criminal scheme. I thought for one brief second that hearing the undeniable truth of their federal fraud would finally wake her up to the horrific reality of what our parents had done. But Chloe did not possess a single shred of a moral compass. She did not care that her father was a thief. She did not care that her groom was a corrupt banker facing a decade behind bars. She was only horrified that her lavish high society wedding was being interrupted. The only thing Chloe cared about was her perfect day. She did not run to Bradley. She did not confront our father. She ran directly to me. Chloe threw herself at the end of the wooden pew where I was sitting. She grabbed the lapels of my dark suit jacket with both of her hands, her grip surprisingly strong. She dropped to her knees right there on the polished stone floor, her massive white dress pooling around her. She looked up at me with wild, completely desperate eyes. She began to weep loudly, weaponizing her tears in a terrifying, calculated display of emotional manipulation. She screamed my name, begging me to listen to her. She cried out that the caterers were already setting up the champagne at the luxury reception hall. She yelled that the photographer was waiting to take their family portraits. She pointed a trembling finger toward the altar and screamed that if Bradley was arrested, the wedding would be entirely ruined. She begged me, pleading at the top of her lungs, to just take the fountain pen out of my pocket and sign the legal paper right now. I stared down at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her demand. I asked her if she had heard a single word Mitchell had just said. I asked her if she understood that our father had stolen $500,000 using my forged signature. I asked her how she could possibly ask me to reward their massive felony by willingly handing over the rest of my property. Chloe did not hesitate. The words poured out of her mouth with a terrifying, absolute entitlement. She screamed that it was just a house. She actually looked me in the eyes, tears streaming down her face, and told me that my $900,000 custom-built estate was just a stupid building. She yelled that I was a successful logistics consultant. She shouted that I worked all the time anyway, and I had plenty of money in the bank. She said I could just go buy another piece of land and build another house next year. She told me I was being completely selfish. She wailed that she had been planning this beautiful wedding for 18 months, and I was destroying her entire life over a meaningless piece of real estate. She begged me to sign the paper right there in front of the entire congregation so the pastor could finish the vows, the federal audit would be satisfied, and she could finally become a wealthy married socialite. I looked down at the woman kneeling in front of me. This was the sister I had protected my entire life. This was the girl whose expensive college textbooks I had paid for when our parents claimed they were short on cash. I had skipped my own vacations to ensure she had everything she wanted. And here she was kneeling in a church, actively begging me to become an accomplice to federal fraud just so she could cut a cake and wear a diamond ring. She did not see me as a brother. She did not see me as a human being with my own dreams, my own grueling hard work, or my own future. To Chloe, to my father, and to my weeping mother sitting next to me in the pew, I was absolutely nothing more than a human ATM. I was a utility. I was a financial shield designed entirely to absorb the devastating consequences of their own reckless, greedy mistakes. They had emotionally conditioned me for 35 years to believe that my only value in this family was what I could provide for them. The heavy, suffocating chains of familial guilt that had bound me to these people for my entire life shattered completely in that exact moment. The profound clarity of the betrayal washed away every single ounce of fear, obligation, and hesitation I had left in my body. Behind Chloe, the church was devolving into total pandemonium. The wealthy congregation could no longer contain their horror. The initial shocked gasps had turned into loud, angry murmurs, and those murmurs were rapidly escalating into furious shouting matches. Bradley's father had marched straight up to the altar and was physically pulling his son away from my father, yelling that his high-priced defense lawyers were going to destroy our family. Bradley's mother was sobbing uncontrollably, completely humiliated by the public spectacle. The wealthy socialites in the back rows were already standing up, grabbing their expensive coats and purses, rushing toward the heavy oak doors to completely distance themselves from the criminal fallout. The two young ushers had backed entirely away from the center aisle, looking terrified as the beautiful wedding completely collapsed into an angry mob. I looked at Mitchell. The razor-sharp corporate attorney was still standing firmly near the altar steps. He was watching the absolute destruction of my family with cold, calculating eyes. He gave me a single slow nod of silent confirmation. His job was done. He had delivered the truth. The rest was entirely up to me. I slowly removed Chloe's desperate, grasping hands from my suit jacket. I pushed her hands away with a firm, undeniable finality. I stood up from the hard wooden pew. The simple action made my father freeze. He stopped yelling at Bradley and turned his dark, furious eyes toward me. My mother stopped her dramatic wailing and looked up at me with sudden, terrifying hope. Chloe scrambled back slightly, staring up at me from the stone floor, her breath hitching in her throat as she waited to see if her tears had worked one final time. I reached down onto the wooden bench. I picked up the thick, folded quitclaim deed. I held the heavy stack of white paper in both of my hands. I looked directly into my father's eyes. I saw the desperate, cornered panic hiding just beneath his furious exterior. I looked down at Chloe, who was still silently mouthing the word, please. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream like Bradley. I did not cry like my mother. I stood perfectly straight, fully grounded in my own strength, and I gripped the top edge of the legal document. I slowly, deliberately ripped the thick stack of paper squarely in half. The sharp, incredibly distinct sound of tearing paper echoed loudly through the chaotic noise of the sanctuary. It was the sound of a $900,000 ransom being completely destroyed. It was the sound of a $500,000 federal fraud being permanently locked into place. I placed the two torn halves together, gripped them tightly, and ripped them again. I tore the quitclaim deed into 4 jagged pieces. The crisp white paper fell apart in my hands, completely destroying the signature line my father had desperately needed. I let the pieces fall from my fingers. The torn fragments of the extortion plot fluttered slowly through the air, landing gently on the plush white aisle runner directly in front of Chloe's expensive wedding dress. I looked at my family, realizing for the first time in my life that I owed them absolutely nothing. I watched the 4 jagged pieces of the quitclaim deed flutter through the air and settle onto the pristine white aisle runner. The physical destruction of that thick legal paper was the final undeniable nail in my father's coffin. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely no one in the massive sanctuary moved. The heavy, suffocating silence returned, broken only by the sound of my sister crying softly on the stone floor. My father stared down at the shredded pieces of his salvation. The stark, terrifying reality of his impending doom finally broke through his thick skull. The federal bank auditors were going to arrive at Bradley's desk on Monday morning. The $500,000 fraudulent loan was now completely exposed. The safety net was gone. The extortion plot had failed, and my father suddenly realized he was going to spend the final years of his life in a federal penitentiary. My father completely lost his mind. He let out a raw, guttural roar that did not sound human. It was the horrific sound of a cornered predator realizing it had just been caught in a lethal trap of its own making. His face turned a dangerous dark shade of purple, the veins in his thick neck bulging violently against his tight white collar. He lunged across the short distance between us, his massive hands reaching out with a desperate, violent intent. His heavy fingers violently grabbed the lapels of my dark suit jacket. He slammed his entire body weight into my chest, driving me backward into the heavy oak pew. The solid wood bit sharply into my lower back, sending a jolt of pain up my spine, but I refused to fall. I planted my feet firmly onto the polished stone floor and braced my core. I did not throw a punch. I did not raise my hands to strike the man who raised me. I simply reached up, gripped his thick wrists with my own hands, and locked my arms entirely. I held him back with a quiet, unyielding strength, staring directly into his manic, bloodshot eyes. He shook me violently, pushing me harder against the wood. Spittle flew from his mouth as he screamed right in my face. He demanded to know what I had done. He shouted that I had killed him, that I had maliciously destroyed the entire family out of pure jealousy. His breath smelled like stale coffee and sheer panic. Behind him, the chaotic murmurs of the wealthy church congregation exploded into genuine screams of alarm. Several guests in the front rows scrambled backward, terrified by the sudden ugly eruption of physical violence in a house of worship. Bradley did not move to help. The groom was still standing near the altar, completely paralyzed by his own impending legal ruin, staring blankly at the manila folder in his hands. But 3 of Bradley's groomsmen suddenly snapped into action. They were young men in matching custom tuxedos, the kind of wealthy, athletic former frat brothers who spent their weekends playing golf at expensive country clubs. They rushed forward in unison, grabbing my father heavily by his broad shoulders and his thick waist. They hauled him backward with everything they had. Their expensive dress shoes slipped slightly on the polished floor as they struggled against his massive thrashing weight. They managed to drag him away from me, pinning his arms tightly to his sides. My father continued to kick and scream wildly. His custom tuxedo became completely wrinkled. His silk tie skewed tightly around his neck, and his perfectly styled hair fell messily across his sweating forehead. He fought against the groomsmen, screaming my name over and over, promising to destroy my life. I stood exactly where I was. I slowly reached up and brushed a speck of dust off my lapel. I adjusted my silk tie, making sure it was perfectly centered. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air-conditioned air fill my lungs completely for the first time all day. I looked at the thrashing, screaming man who had terrorized me for 35 years, and I felt absolutely nothing. I felt no fear. I felt no guilt. I felt no anger. I only felt a profound, hollow pity. My absolute stillness infuriated my father more than a physical blow ever could. He stopped kicking for a brief second and stared at me. He realized in that exact moment that he had completely lost his power. His threats no longer worked. His physical size no longer intimidated me. I was no longer his terrified son, desperate for his approval. I was a grown man who had just systematically dismantled his entire criminal operation without raising my voice. My mother watched this violent exchange with wide, horrified eyes. She stood trembling near the wooden pew, watching her husband being physically restrained like a violent criminal. She saw the wealthy guests pointing and whispering in absolute disgust. She saw the elite society women in the back rows pulling out their smartphones to record the disastrous spectacle. Susan realized instantly that physical intimidation had completely failed, and their carefully crafted social image was rapidly bleeding to death right on the pristine white carpet. My mother was a master of psychological manipulation, and she knew she had only seconds left to control the narrative before the elite society of this city permanently exiled her from their country clubs. She turned her back on her thrashing husband and ran directly toward the altar. Her expensive designer high heels clicked frantically against the stone steps. The pastor was standing near the carved wooden podium, clutching his heavy Bible to his chest, looking completely paralyzed by the utter destruction of his holy sacrament. My mother did not ask for permission. She reached out and violently ripped the wireless microphone right out of the holy man's trembling hand. The sudden aggressive movement caused a loud, piercing burst of static feedback to shriek through the massive sanctuary speakers. The awful sound forced several guests to cover their ears temporarily, halting the loud arguments in the pews. The church fell into a tense, ringing silence as every single eye turned to look at the mother of the bride. Susan stood at the absolute center of the altar, taking the exact spot where her daughter was supposed to take her eternal vows. She gripped the black microphone tightly with both of her hands. Her face was flushed and her chest was heaving, but she forced her features into an expression of profound maternal tragedy. She spoke into the microphone, her voice artificially loud and echoing flawlessly through the vaulted ceilings. She addressed the horrified congregation, completely ignoring the fact that her husband was still being physically restrained 10 feet away. She told the crowd to please calm down. She begged them to stay in their seats and not to leave. She stated that her family was experiencing a horrific, intensely private medical emergency, and she was so incredibly sorry that it had spilled out into this beautiful ceremony. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, her face twisting into a mask of fake sorrow. Her voice cracked perfectly with rehearsed emotion as she announced to 300 people that I was severely mentally unwell. She claimed I was currently suffering from a massive paranoid psychological breakdown. She told the silent crowd that I had stopped taking my heavy psychiatric medication weeks ago, and that the overwhelming stress of my sister's high society wedding had completely shattered my fragile grip on reality. I stood by the wooden pew and listened to my own mother assassinate my character in real time. She did not miss a single beat. The lies flowed from her mouth like poisoned honey. She turned and pointed her microphone toward Mitchell, my razor-sharp corporate attorney, who was still standing calmly near the side aisle. She told the wealthy guests that Mitchell was not a real lawyer. She claimed he was a dangerous enabler, a random actor I had hired off the street to feed into my psychotic delusions. She spun a wild, desperate fantasy, assuring the crowd that there was no forged legal document, no stolen money, and absolutely no federal bank investigation. She swore to God that the papers in Mitchell's hand were nothing more than the chaotic scribblings of a deeply disturbed mind. Susan then looked directly at Bradley's wealthy parents, who were standing frozen in the front row. She spoke directly to them, her voice dripping with desperation. She pleaded with the powerful executive to understand the heavy burden her family carried. She said they had tried everything to get me psychiatric help for years, but I had aggressively refused. She claimed that this entire terrifying outburst was just my sick, twisted way of seeking attention and ruining a day of pure love because I was entirely incapable of feeling joy myself. She begged the congregation to find it in their Christian hearts to forgive a sick, jealous man for his terrible disruption, and she pleaded with the pastor to let the holy ceremony continue as planned so her daughter could be happy. It was a masterful performance. It was a completely seamless, terrifying display of sociopathic self-preservation. She was actively trying to send me to a psychiatric ward just to cover up a $500,000 bank fraud. Some of the older guests in the back rows actually stopped moving toward the doors. They looked confused, whispering to each other, genuinely wondering if they were witnessing a massive criminal conspiracy or just a tragic family health crisis. My mother was sweating profusely under the bright altar lights, but she kept her voice perfectly steady, fighting tooth and nail to salvage her precious social standing. But her toxic words held absolutely no power over me anymore. I did not shout back at her to defend myself. I did not interrupt her unhinged, manipulative speech. I let her voice echo through the massive room, letting her completely expose the bottomless depths of her own depravity. Every second she spoke, she dug her own grave deeper. I looked away from the altar and scanned the chaotic scene until I found Mitchell. My attorney was standing perfectly still near the marble baptismal font, his leather briefcase resting quietly by his side. He was watching me closely, ignoring my mother's screaming accusations entirely. He was a professional, and he knew that words meant absolutely nothing in the face of hard physical evidence. The time for arguing was completely over. The time for legal threats and family drama had permanently passed. It was time for the absolute terrifying reality of the justice system to take complete control of this situation. I looked directly into Mitchell's sharp eyes across the room. I gave him a single, slow, deliberate nod. Mitchell did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He did not scroll through his contacts. He did not dial a long number. He simply pressed a single button on his screen and brought the sleek device to his ear. He spoke exactly 2 words into the receiver, turned his back to the screaming altar, and slipped the phone right back into his pocket. My mother continued to babble hysterically into the microphone, begging the organist to start playing the wedding march again, demanding that the ushers force the remaining guests back into their seats. She was completely oblivious to the world outside the heavy church doors, but I saw it instantly. The massive, beautiful stained glass windows lining the eastern wall of the sanctuary suddenly began to change color. The bright, warm afternoon sunlight shining through the colored glass was violently interrupted. A harsh, rapid strobing effect washed over the intricate religious artwork. Flashing, undeniable pulses of bright blue and piercing red light began to sweep aggressively through the tall stained glass windows, painting the interior stone walls of the church in the stark, unmistakable colors of arriving law enforcement. I watched the 4 jagged pieces of the quitclaim deed flutter through the air and settle onto the pristine white aisle runner. The physical destruction of the thick legal paper was the final undeniable nail in my father's coffin. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely no one in the massive sanctuary moved. The heavy, suffocating silence returned, broken only by the sound of my sister crying softly on the stone floor. My father stared down at the shredded pieces of his salvation. The stark, terrifying reality of his impending doom finally broke through his thick skull. The federal bank auditors were going to arrive at Bradley's desk on Monday morning. The $500,000 fraudulent loan was now completely exposed. The safety net was gone. The extortion plot had failed, and my father suddenly realized he was going to spend the final years of his life in a federal penitentiary. My father completely lost his mind. He let out a raw, guttural roar that did not sound human. It was the horrific sound of a cornered predator realizing it had just been caught in a lethal trap of its own making. His face turned a dangerous dark shade of purple, the veins in his thick neck bulging violently against his tight white collar. He lunged across the short distance between us, his massive hands reaching out with desperate, violent intent. His heavy fingers violently grabbed the lapels of my dark suit jacket. He slammed his entire body weight into my chest, driving me backward into the heavy oak pew. The solid wood bit sharply into my lower back, sending a jolt of pain up my spine, but I refused to fall. I planted my feet firmly onto the polished stone floor and braced my core. I did not throw a punch. I did not raise my hands to strike the man who raised me. I simply reached up, gripped his thick wrists with my own hands, and locked my arms entirely. I held him back, with a quiet, unyielding strength staring directly into his manic, bloodshot eyes. He shook me violently, pushing me harder against the wood. Spittle flew from his mouth as he screamed right in my face. He demanded to know what I had done. He shouted that I had killed him, that I had maliciously destroyed the entire family out of pure jealousy. His breath smelled like stale coffee and sheer panic. Behind him, the chaotic murmurs of the wealthy church congregation exploded into genuine screams of alarm. Several guests in the front row scrambled backward, terrified by the sudden, ugly eruption of physical violence in a house of worship. Bradley did not move to help. The groom was still standing near the altar, completely paralyzed by his own impending legal ruin, staring blankly at the manila folder in his hands. But three of Bradley's groomsmen suddenly snapped into action. They were young men in matching custom tuxedos, the kind of wealthy, athletic former frat brothers who spent their weekends playing golf at expensive country clubs. They rushed forward in unison, grabbing my father heavily by his broad shoulders and his thick waist. They hauled him backward with everything they had. Their expensive dress shoes slipped slightly on the polished floor as they struggled against his massive thrashing weight. They managed to drag him away from me, pinning his arms tightly to his sides. My father continued to kick and scream wildly. His custom tuxedo became completely wrinkled. His silk tie skewed tightly around his neck, and his perfectly styled hair fell messily across his sweating forehead. He fought against the groomsmen, screaming my name over and over, promising to destroy my life. I stood exactly where I was. I slowly reached up and brushed a speck of dust off my lapel. I adjusted my silk tie, making sure it was perfectly centered. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool, air-conditioned air fill my lungs completely for the first time all day. I looked at the thrashing, screaming man who had terrorized me for 35 years, and I felt absolutely nothing. I felt no fear. I felt no guilt. I felt no anger. I only felt a profound, hollow pity. My absolute stillness infuriated my father more than a physical blow ever could. He stopped kicking for a brief second and stared at me. He realized in that exact moment that he had completely lost his power. His threats no longer worked. His physical size no longer intimidated me. I was no longer his terrified son, desperate for his approval. I was a grown man who had just systematically dismantled his entire criminal operation without raising my voice. My mother watched this violent exchange with wide, horrified eyes. She stood trembling near the wooden pew, watching her husband being physically restrained like a violent criminal. She saw the wealthy guests pointing and whispering in absolute disgust. She saw the elite society women in the back rows pulling out their smartphones to record the disastrous spectacle. Susan realized instantly that physical intimidation had completely failed, and their carefully crafted social image was rapidly bleeding to death right on the pristine white carpet. My mother was a master of psychological manipulation, and she knew she had only seconds left to control the narrative before the elite society of this city permanently exiled her from their country clubs. She turned her back on her thrashing husband and ran directly toward the altar. Her expensive designer high heels clicked frantically against the stone steps. The pastor was standing near the carved wooden podium, clutching his heavy Bible to his chest, looking completely paralyzed by the utter destruction of his holy sacrament. My mother did not ask for permission. She reached out and violently ripped the wireless microphone right out of the holy man's trembling hand. The sudden, aggressive movement caused a loud, piercing burst of static feedback to shriek through the massive sanctuary speakers. The awful sound forced several guests to cover their ears temporarily, halting the loud arguments in the pews. The church fell into a tense, ringing silence as every single eye turned to look at the mother of the bride. Susan stood at the absolute center of the altar, taking the exact spot where her daughter was supposed to take her eternal vows. She gripped the black microphone tightly with both of her hands. Her face was flushed and her chest was heaving, but she forced her features into an expression of profound maternal tragedy. She spoke into the microphone, her voice artificially loud and echoing flawlessly through the vaulted ceilings. She addressed the horrified congregation, completely ignoring the fact that her husband was still being physically restrained 10 feet away. She told the crowd to please calm down. She begged them to stay in their seats and not to leave. She stated that her family was experiencing a horrific, intensely private medical emergency, and she was so incredibly sorry that it had spilled out into this beautiful ceremony. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, her face twisting into a mask of fake sorrow. Her voice cracked perfectly with rehearsed emotion as she announced to 300 people that I was severely mentally unwell. She claimed I was currently suffering from a massive paranoid psychological breakdown. She told the silent crowd that I had stopped taking my heavy psychiatric medication weeks ago and that the overwhelming stress of my sister's high society wedding had completely shattered my fragile grip on reality. I stood by the wooden pew and listened to my own mother assassinate my character in real time. She did not miss a single beat. The lies flowed from her mouth like poisoned honey. She turned and pointed her microphone toward Mitchell, my razor-sharp corporate attorney, who was still standing calmly near the side aisle. She told the wealthy guests that Mitchell was not a real lawyer. She claimed he was a dangerous enabler, a random actor I had hired off the street to feed into my psychotic delusions. She spun a wild, desperate fantasy, assuring the crowd that there was no forged legal document, no stolen money, and absolutely no federal bank investigation. She swore to God that the papers in Mitchell's hand were nothing more than the chaotic scribblings of a deeply disturbed mind. Susan then looked directly at Bradley's wealthy parents, who were standing frozen in the front row. She spoke directly to them, her voice dripping with desperation. She pleaded with the powerful executive to understand the heavy burden her family carried. She said they had tried everything to get me psychiatric help for years, but I had aggressively refused. She claimed that this entire terrifying outburst was just my sick, twisted way of seeking attention and ruining a day of pure love because I was entirely incapable of feeling joy myself. She begged the congregation to find it in their Christian hearts to forgive a sick, jealous man for his terrible disruption, and she pleaded with the pastor to let the holy ceremony continue as planned so her daughter could be happy. It was a masterful performance. It was a completely seamless, terrifying display of sociopathic self-preservation. She was actively trying to send me to a psychiatric ward just to cover up a $500,000 bank fraud. Some of the older guests in the back rows actually stopped moving toward the doors. They looked confused, whispering to each other, genuinely wondering if they were witnessing a massive criminal conspiracy or just a tragic family health crisis. My mother was sweating profusely under the bright altar lights, but she kept her voice perfectly steady, fighting tooth and nail to salvage her precious social standing. But her toxic words held absolutely no power over me anymore. I did not shout back at her to defend myself. I did not interrupt her unhinged, manipulative speech. I let her voice echo through the massive room, letting her completely expose the bottomless depths of her own depravity. Every second she spoke, she dug her own grave deeper. I looked away from the altar and scanned the chaotic scene until I found Mitchell. My attorney was standing perfectly still near the marble baptismal font, his leather briefcase resting quietly by his side. He was watching me closely, ignoring my mother's screaming accusations entirely. He was a professional, and he knew that words meant absolutely nothing in the face of hard physical evidence. The time for arguing was completely over. The time for legal threats and family drama had permanently passed. It was time for the absolute terrifying reality of the justice system to take complete control of this situation. I looked directly into Mitchell's sharp eyes across the room. I gave him a single, slow, deliberate nod. Mitchell did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He did not scroll through his contacts. He did not dial a long number. He simply pressed a single button on his screen and brought the sleek device to his ear. He spoke exactly 2 words into the receiver, turned his back to the screaming altar, and slipped the phone right back into his pocket. My mother continued to babble hysterically into the microphone, begging the organist to start playing the wedding march again, demanding that the ushers force the remaining guests back into their seats. She was completely oblivious to the world outside the heavy church doors, but I saw it instantly. The massive, beautiful stained glass windows lining the eastern wall of the sanctuary suddenly began to change color. The bright, warm afternoon sunlight shining through the colored glass was violently interrupted. A harsh, rapid strobing effect washed over the intricate religious artwork. Flashing undeniable pulses of bright blue and piercing red light began to sweep aggressively through the tall stained glass windows, painting the interior stone walls of the church in the stark, unmistakable colors of arriving law enforcement. The detective had asked for proof. I reached into the right front pocket of my suit trousers and pulled out my smartphone. The device felt heavy and incredibly warm in my hand. It was the exact same phone my mother had violently snatched from my grip inside the locked vestry room just 30 minutes ago. But in her desperate panic to control the situation, she had failed to realize something absolutely crucial. When my parents first closed that heavy oak door and my father shoved the quitclaim deed into my chest, I had subtly pressed my thumb against the side button of my phone. I had activated the voice memo recording application before my mother ever lunged at me. The device had been actively recording every single vile threat, every extortion demand, and every sociopathic confession from deep inside the dark interior of her expensive silver designer bag. The lead financial crimes detective, a tall, imposing man wearing a tan trench coat over a sharp gray suit, stepped closer to me. He looked down at the phone resting in my palm. He asked me directly, his voice low and intensely serious, if I had successfully captured audio evidence of the coercion that Mitchell had just described to the congregation. I looked the detective in the eye and told him yes. I told him I possessed over 15 minutes of high-definition, uninterrupted audio detailing exactly how my family had planned to extort my property to cover up a $500,000 federal banking fraud. The detective nodded slowly, his expression hardening. He told me he needed to hear the recording right now. Before I could simply press play on the small, inadequate device speaker, a young man stepped quickly out of the shadows near the side choir loft. He was the church sound engineer, a college-aged kid wearing a black polo shirt with a heavy headset resting comfortably around his neck. He had been sitting up in the elevated sound booth at the very back of the sanctuary, watching the entire dramatic spectacle unfold below him. He looked completely enthralled by the chaos, his eyes wide with a mixture of sheer shock and absolute entertainment. He jogged down the carpeted side aisle, holding a long black auxiliary audio cable tightly in his right hand. He stopped respectfully a few feet away from the detective and pointed a finger toward my smartphone. He spoke up, his voice echoing slightly in the tense room, stating that if we wanted everyone in the building to hear the absolute truth clearly, he could plug the phone directly into the main mixing board. He explained eagerly that the church had recently upgraded its massive surround sound system and the audio recording would project flawlessly through every single high-fidelity speaker in the sanctuary. My mother, still standing near the altar where she had just delivered her hysterical lies, let out a sharp, piercing gasp of sheer terror. She screamed at the young sound technician, her voice cracking wildly, demanding he return to his booth and turn the main power off immediately. She ordered the terrified pastor to fire the boy on the spot. But the pastor simply lowered his head, clutched his Bible to his chest, and took a slow step backward, completely surrendering his religious authority to the armed police officers standing in his church. The detective looked at the eager sound engineer, gave a firm, authoritative nod of approval, and motioned for him to proceed. The young man walked confidently over to me, took the thick auxiliary cable, and plugged the metal jack directly into the bottom port of my smartphone. He quickly tapped a few digital buttons on a wireless mixing tablet he was carrying, adjusting the master volume for the massive room. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with anticipation, and gave a quick thumbs up. I unlocked my digital screen, opened the voice memo application, tapped the most recent saved audio file, and pressed play. There was a brief, sharp second of static hiss, and then the massive church speakers roared to life with terrifying clarity. The audio quality was exceptional. The first sound that violently echoed through the vaulted stone ceilings was the loud, metallic, unmistakable click of the heavy brass deadbolt sliding into place, trapping me in the room. Then my own recorded voice rang out, asking my parents if this was some kind of sick joke. The 300 wealthy guests sitting in the wooden pews froze completely. They were trapped in a surreal, inescapable theater of absolute reality. They sat in a holy sanctuary, surrounded by beautiful imported white roses and silk ribbons, listening to the darkest, most corrupted sins of their peers, broadcast at maximum volume. My father's recorded voice boomed through the massive church. It was not the polished, friendly, charming tone he used to impress his friends at the local country club. It was the vicious, gravelly, terrifying snarl of a cornered criminal. Every single person in the room heard him clearly state that he was not asking for a favor, but actively collecting a debt. Everyone heard him maliciously threaten to ruin my professional name, destroy my logistics business, and publicly humiliate me if I did not sign my $900,000 custom-built home over to him immediately. My mother reacted instantly. She threw her hands up and covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut as tightly as possible, as if she could somehow block out the devastating reality of her own recorded words. But the massive speakers were absolutely relentless. The recording played the exact moment my mother stopped her fake, manipulative crying. The congregation heard the drastic, terrifying shift in her tone. They heard her coldly, calculatingly explain that my massive property was acting as a mandatory dowry for Bradley's wealthy family. They heard her admit, without a single shred of shame, that she needed my house to save her precious social standing at the country club. The sheer, unadulterated vanity and toxic greed in her recorded voice made several older women sitting in the front rows physically recoil in deep disgust. Then came the most devastating, undeniable part of the audio file. The recording played the exact moment I angrily demanded to call my sister Chloe. The entire church heard the violent scuffle as my mother snatched the phone from my hand. They heard her unhinged, mocking laugh, and then they heard my mother openly reveal that the entire extortion plot was Chloe's idea from the very beginning. The crisp audio confirmed to the entire world that the beautiful weeping bride standing near the vestibule was completely complicit. She had lied directly to Bradley's wealthy parents, falsely claimed my house was hers to give, and willingly sacrificed her own brother's financial future just to secure her elite high society marriage. To ensure the destruction was absolute, the audio captured the final desperate threat. My father's voice echoed one last time, explicitly stating that Bradley was actively waiting in the groom's room, fully demanding the signed quitclaim deed to cover up his own financial liabilities before the vows could be legally completed. The recording perfectly tied the groom, the bride, and both parents into one massive, undeniable federal criminal conspiracy. I reached down and calmly pressed the pause button on my phone screen. The audio cut out instantly, leaving a heavy, ringing, absolute silence in its wake. The social execution of my family was completely finalized. There was absolutely no recovering from this moment. My mother's desperate theatrical lies about me having a severe psychiatric breakdown were permanently shattered by the hard physical evidence of her own toxic voice. The wealthy congregation did not just judge them quietly, they utterly and completely condemned them. The older, highly traditional members of the church people who valued personal integrity, legal obedience, and pristine reputation above all else looked at my parents with absolute unmasked revulsion. A prominent local judge, a man my father had played golf with every single Sunday for over 20 years, stood up slowly from his seat in the fourth row. He did not say a single word. He did not offer a look of pity. He simply buttoned his expensive suit jacket, turned his back entirely on the altar, and began walking down the center carpeted aisle toward the exit. His silent, damning departure triggered a massive, unstoppable wave of social abandonment. One by one, the elite local socialites, the wealthy corporate business partners, and the longtime family friends stood up from the hard wooden pews. They actively refused to look at my weeping mother. They completely ignored my sister standing frozen in her extravagant white dress. They gathered their expensive coats and their designer purses, stepping out into the aisle and walking away in pure, unadulterated disgust. The low murmurs of the departing crowd were incredibly harsh and completely unforgiving. Words like disgusting criminals and pathetic drifted heavily through the air. They were actively wiping my family from their exclusive social registry in real time. The flawless illusion of the high-status perfect family was entirely dead, and its corpse was being left to rot openly on the pristine white carpet. Bradley's parents were completely destroyed by the revelation. The powerful corporate executive looked at his son with a terrifying mixture of profound fury and deep, inescapable shame. He did not step forward to try and defend his boy anymore. He realized in that exact moment that Bradley had not just made a simple accidental banking error. His son had willingly, eagerly participated in a massive federal felony just to marry into a family of complete frauds. The executive violently grabbed his weeping wife by the arm and practically dragged her out of the front pew, marching swiftly toward the heavy oak doors without looking back once. Bradley stood near the altar and watched his own wealthy parents completely abandon him, his shoulders slumping heavily in total, crushing defeat. The lead financial crimes detective let out a long, heavy sigh. He turned away from the departing crowd of wealthy guests and looked directly at the uniformed police officers flanking him near the baptismal font. He gave them a single sharp, undeniable nod. The time for gathering evidence and questioning suspects was officially over. The time for physical legal action had arrived. Two large, imposing police officers stepped heavily onto the elevated stone altar. They completely ignored the beautiful floral arrangements and the holy atmosphere of the sanctuary. They walked directly up to Bradley. The groom did not try to run. He did not try to fight or argue his innocence. He simply held his shaking hands out in front of him, his eyes staring blankly at the polished stone floor. The loud metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around his wrists echoed sharply in the rapidly emptying church. His incredibly expensive custom-tailored tuxedo jacket bunched up awkwardly as the officers pulled his arms firmly behind his back. The wealthy elite man, who had illegally authorized a $500,000 loan, was now officially a federal prisoner. Two other officers marched aggressively over to the side aisle where my father was standing. Richard had completely stopped fighting. The immense, furious physical strength that had fueled his earlier rage was entirely gone, completely drained from his body by the absolute certainty of his doom. He looked incredibly old, incredibly tired, and incredibly small. When the police officer grabbed his thick right wrist and pulled it forcefully backward, my father let out a soft, pathetic whimper of defeat. The cold steel cuffs clicked shut firmly, permanently locking the proud, manipulative, abusive patriarch in heavy chains. Chloe stood completely frozen near the vestibule archway, watching her wealthy fiancé and her father being physically marched away by armed police officers. Her massive, extravagant white wedding gown suddenly looked like a ridiculous, deeply tragic costume. Her lifelong fairy tale of immense wealth and high social status was completely over, entirely replaced by the harsh, unforgiving, brutal reality of the criminal justice system. My mother, the woman who had masterminded and orchestrated this entire living nightmare just to save her superficial social standing, watched the absolute elite members of her beloved country club walk out the door while her husband was hauled away like a common street criminal. The sheer crushing weight of her total, undeniable, permanent ruin finally broke her completely. Susan let out a long, agonizing, genuinely shattered wail of pure despair, her legs buckling completely beneath her. She collapsed heavily into the empty front wooden pew, burying her face deeply into the polished wood, weeping bitterly as the bright flashing red and blue police lights washed relentlessly over her trembling shoulders. The bright morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of Mitchell's downtown corner office. It was exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. The chaotic, suffocating nightmare of the weekend felt like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. I sat in a deep leather chair, holding a warm cup of black coffee, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The silence in the room was not the heavy, terrifying silence of the church vestry. It was the calm, absolute silence of total victory. I took a slow sip of my coffee and let out a long breath. The crushing weight of the forged debt, the decades of emotional manipulation, and the relentless pressure to fund my family's toxic illusions had all been completely stripped away. I was finally breathing free air. Mitchell sat directly across from me behind his massive mahogany desk. He looked exactly as sharp and composed as he had standing at the altar on Saturday afternoon. He was wearing a dark navy suit and an immaculate white shirt. He did not look tired. He looked like a man who had just successfully executed a flawless corporate takeover. He reached out and opened a thick, fresh manila folder on his desk. The papers inside were not forged quitclaim deeds or desperate extortion demands. They were official, undeniable, legal documents detailing the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to ruin my life. Mitchell looked up from the folder, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. He told me that the federal banking auditors had arrived exactly at 8 o'clock this morning, just as he had promised. They walked straight into the commercial lending branch where Bradley worked. They immediately requested all the files related to my father's massive secondary loan. Mitchell told me the auditors did not even have to dig deep. The glaring irregularities in the underwriting process, the completely bypassed security protocols, and the forged signature on the power of attorney document were immediately flagged by the federal team. The entire criminal conspiracy was dragged completely into the light before the bank even opened its doors to the public. Mitchell leaned back in his leather chair and explained the full terrifying scope of the fallout for the groom. Bradley was not sitting at his polished desk this morning. He was currently sitting in a cold concrete holding cell at the county detention center, still wearing the wrinkled, ruined trousers of his expensive custom tuxedo. The commercial bank had officially fired him the very second the federal auditors confirmed the massive fraud. His lucrative career as a senior loan officer was permanently over. His professional banking license was completely revoked. He was no longer a wealthy, respected member of high society. He was a disgraced, unemployed federal criminal. The legal reality Bradley was facing was absolutely catastrophic. Mitchell read directly from the official charging documents. Bradley was not just facing a simple slap on the wrist or a minor civil penalty. He was being officially charged with multiple counts of severe federal wire fraud, the deliberate falsification of commercial loan documents, and massive bank fraud. Mitchell explained that the federal justice system does not show any mercy to corrupt bankers who actively abuse their institutional power to facilitate theft. Because of the massive $500,000 value of the forged loan, Bradley was looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The absolute worst part of Bradley's total downfall was the complete abandonment by his own wealthy family. Mitchell told me that Bradley's father, the powerful corporate executive who had demanded my home as a wedding dowry, had completely cut his son off. The wealthy patriarch was so deeply humiliated by the public spectacle at the church and so terrified of having his own pristine corporate reputation dragged into a federal banking scandal that he absolutely refused to post Bradley's bail. He refused to hire a high-priced defense attorney for his son. Bradley was completely isolated, left to face the crushing weight of the federal government entirely alone, defended only by an overworked public defender. His dream of a wealthy elite life with my sister had instantly transformed into a decade behind steel bars. Right as Mitchell finished explaining Bradley's grim future, the heavy silence of the office was suddenly broken. The sleek digital phone sitting on Mitchell's mahogany desk began to ring loudly. Mitchell looked at the caller identification screen, his expression hardening into a cold professional mask. He looked up at me and stated plainly that it was a collect call from the county correctional facility. My parents were calling. Mitchell asked me if I wanted him to reject the call or if I wanted to hear exactly what they had to say. I did not hesitate. I told him to put it on speakerphone. I wanted to hear the voices of the people who had tried to destroy me. Mitchell pressed a button on the console. A loud, automated voice announced the collect call from an inmate, followed by a sharp beep. Then the desperate, completely broken voice of my mother filled the quiet office. Susan was crying. It was not the fake, manipulative, theatrical crying she used to control the narrative at the country club or the church altar. It was a raw, ugly, genuinely terrified weeping. She frantically called out my name, begging me to answer the phone. My father's voice chimed in right behind hers, completely stripped of all his toxic pride and terrifying rage. Richard sounded incredibly old, his voice shaking violently as he begged me to please listen to reason. They pleaded with me to drop the charges. My father swore to God that he was incredibly sorry. He claimed that he had just made a terrible, desperate mistake because his business was failing and he wanted to give Chloe a beautiful life. My mother wailed into the receiver, screaming that the concrete cell was freezing and she was terrified. She begged me to call the police and tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. She invoked the sacred bond of family, screaming that they were my parents, that they gave me life, and that I could not possibly let them rot in a filthy jail cell over a simple financial dispute. They honestly believed that they could still manipulate me. They believed that if they just cried hard enough and apologized, I would wave a magic wand and make the massive federal felony disappear. Mitchell leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. He did not let me speak. He addressed my weeping parents with a voice so cold and authoritative, it completely silenced their desperate pleas. Mitchell told Richard and Susan that they needed to stop crying and start listening to the absolute terrifying reality of their situation. He explained to them in brutal, plain English that Harrison was not the one pressing the charges. He told them that they did not steal money from my personal bank account. They had forged federal legal documents and defrauded a massive federally insured commercial banking institution out of $500,000. Mitchell stated clearly that the state prosecutors and the federal banking regulators were the ones driving the massive criminal case. It was completely out of my hands. Even if I wanted to drop the charges, which I absolutely did not, I possessed no legal authority to do so. The crime was against the federal government. Mitchell told my parents that they had crossed a legal line that could never be uncrossed, and their tears meant absolutely nothing to the federal prosecutors who were currently drafting their prison sentences. The devastating reality of their absolute lack of control finally set in over the phone line. My father let out a long, hollow groan of pure despair, completely realizing that his manipulative tactics were entirely useless. But Mitchell was not finished delivering the bad news. He needed my parents to understand the full catastrophic scope of their financial ruin. Mitchell informed them that the commercial bank was not just going to wait patiently for a criminal trial to recover their stolen $500,000. The bank was actively mobilizing its massive legal department to claw back every single penny of the fraudulent loan immediately. Mitchell explained that the state had already moved first thing this morning to completely freeze every single financial asset my parents owned. Their checking accounts were locked. Their saving accounts were seized. The remaining funds in their retirement portfolios, the very money they had claimed was vanishing, were completely wiped out by the bank to cover the immediate restitution of the stolen funds. They had absolutely zero access to cash. They could not afford to hire private defense attorneys. They could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee from the jail commissary. Furthermore, Mitchell revealed the ultimate crushing blow to their precious social standing. To cover the massive impending legal fees and the massive fines associated with the federal fraud charges, the bank had formally initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on their primary luxury residence. The massive, beautiful home they used to host their elite country club friends was being legally seized. They were going to lose the house, the luxury cars, and every single material possession they had desperately tried to protect. By attempting to steal my $900,000 debt-free home, my parents had completely and permanently destroyed their own. Mitchell did not wait for their weeping response. He reached out and pressed the red button on the digital console, permanently disconnecting the call and returning the office to a state of perfect, peaceful silence. I sat back in my deep leather chair, absorbing the absolute totality of my parents' destruction. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt completely vindicated. The universe had finally balanced the scales, and the people who had abused my hard work for decades were finally paying the ultimate price. I picked up my coffee cup, ready to discuss the final steps for totally clearing the fraudulent lien from my property title. But before Mitchell could open the next legal document, the sleek intercom speaker on his desk buzzed sharply. The calm, professional voice of Mitchell's front desk receptionist filled the room. She sounded slightly annoyed and incredibly confused. She told Mitchell that there was a young woman in the lobby aggressively demanding to see Harrison immediately. The receptionist stated that the woman was making a massive scene, refusing to leave until she was granted access to the private office. I did not need to guess who it was. The heavy mahogany office doors suddenly swung open with a loud bang. Chloe marched right past the protesting receptionist and stepped directly into the center of the room. My sister looked like an absolute disaster. The flawless, angelic bride from Saturday afternoon was completely gone. She was wearing a pair of expensive designer sweatpants and a wrinkled silk blouse. Her perfectly styled hair was a messy, tangled knot on top of her head. Her face was puffy red and completely devoid of makeup. She carried a massive designer tote bag over her shoulder, stuffed to the brim with random clothes. But as I looked at her, I realized immediately that she was not there to offer a tearful apology. She was not there to beg for my forgiveness for actively participating in the extortion plot that nearly ruined my life. She was entirely oblivious to the monumental gravity of her own horrible actions. She stood in the center of the sharp corporate office, crossed her arms over her chest, and looked at me with the exact same toxic, absolutely unshakable entitlement she had displayed her entire life. She looked me dead in the eyes and demanded that I hand over the keys to my $900,000 house, stating that since her fiancé was locked in a federal prison and our parents were completely homeless, she was moving into my estate today. I stared at my sister standing right in the center of the office. She had just demanded the keys to my house. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the quiet corporate room like toxic smoke. She dropped her heavy designer tote bag onto the plush carpet with a loud thud and crossed her arms over her chest. She tapped her expensive leather shoe against the floor as if she were waiting for a slow valet to bring her a luxury car. She did not even glance at Mitchell sitting behind his massive desk. She just stared directly at me with those cold, expectant, completely unyielding eyes. She actually believed that because her criminal fiancé was currently locked in a concrete holding cell and our parents were entirely broke and facing total ruin, the absolute logical next step in the universe was for me to surrender my massive estate to her. She fully expected me to just reach into my pocket hand over the physical metal keys and walk away so she could live a life of comfort and luxury while I presumably went back to renting a cheap apartment. I stood up slowly from my deep leather chair. I walked around the massive mahogany desk and stopped just a few feet away from her. I looked closely at her messy, tangled hair, her wrinkled silk blouse, and the deep, ugly scowl of profound entitlement permanently etched into her features. For the first time in my entire 35 years of life, I did not see my little sister. I did not see a fragile family member I needed to endlessly protect, defend, or financially provide for. I saw a complete stranger. I saw a willing parasite who had spent 28 years happily feeding on my relentless hard work and our parents' dangerous financial delusions. I asked her if she honestly believed the words that had just come out of her mouth. I asked her if she had somehow magically forgotten the traumatic events of Saturday afternoon. I reminded her in a low, dangerous voice that she had actively plotted with our parents to lock me in a church vestry and violently extort my life savings. I reminded her that she had knelt on the cold stone floor of the sanctuary and violently screamed at me, crying fake tears and begging me to become an active accomplice to a massive federal bank fraud, just so she could have a wealthy elite socialite wedding. Chloe rolled her eyes in profound, unbelievable annoyance. She actually rolled her eyes at the direct mention of her own federal crimes. She let out a loud, dramatic, heavy sigh and told me to stop being so incredibly dramatic about the whole thing. She said Saturday was just a massive, unfortunate misunderstanding. She claimed that our father was the one who went way too far with the forged bank loan, and she was simply trying to keep the family together for the sake of the wedding. She looked around the beautiful, expensive corporate office, waved her hand dismissively at the city skyline outside the window and said, none of that past drama mattered anymore. She told me she had absolutely nowhere else to go. Her wealthy society friends had completely blocked her phone number. The elite country club had permanently cancelled her family membership. She said I was her big brother, and it was my absolute unbreakable moral duty to take care of her when she was down. She held out her hand again, palm facing up, and commanded me to give her the keys to my property right this second. I did not hand her anything. I kept my hands firmly relaxed at my sides and looked down at her extended palm with absolute disgust. I told her that for 35 years, I had been the designated silent scapegoat of this entire family. I explained loudly that I was the one who was forced to take out massive student loans to educate myself, while our parents bought her a brand new custom-ordered convertible for doing absolutely nothing. I was the one who worked brutal 80-hour weeks in a sweltering warehouse and slept on a deflated air mattress while they happily funded her month-long luxury vacations across the villas of Europe. I told her that I had spent my entire adult life meticulously building an impenetrable fortress of financial security, while she had spent her entire life treating my personal bank account like an endless magical money well. I systematically and ruthlessly broke down every single delusion she held in her head. I told her she was not a tragic victim of circumstance. I told her she was a willing, eager, toxic participant in a massive criminal extortion plot. I reminded her that she had lied directly to Bradley's wealthy parents for months, falsely claiming my $900,000 property was hers to freely give away as a dowry. I told her she had actively weaponized our parents' desperation and greed to steal the only thing I had ever built completely for myself. Chloe's pale face began to turn a bright, angry shade of crimson red. She dropped her empty hand and clenched both of her fists tightly by her sides. She started to raise her voice, sucking in a deep breath to prepare for one of her classic, terrifying, house-shaking tantrums. She opened her mouth to scream that I was a selfish, horrible, ungrateful person who hated his own family, but I did not let her speak a single syllable. I cut her off completely. My voice was incredibly calm, incredibly deep, and entirely unyielding. I told her the free ride was permanently over. I told her the Bank of Harrison was completely closed, the vault was locked forever, and the keys were thrown into the ocean. I explained that she was a 28-year-old adult entirely capable of getting a minimum wage job, and it was time for her to finally enter the harsh reality of the real world. I told her she was going to have to learn exactly how to pay her own monthly rent, buy her own cheap groceries, and solve her own massive problems without ever stealing another dime from me. I stepped 1 inch closer, looked her dead in the terrified eyes, and told her that I was completely severing the blood tie right here and now. From this exact second forward, she was not my little sister. She was just a corrupt, entitled, dangerous woman who had tried to ruin my entire life. She stared at me in absolute, profound, paralyzing shock. The cold, heavy reality of my words hit her like a physical brick wall. No one in our entire family history had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked her in the eyes, told her no, and actually meant it with absolute finality. She opened her mouth to argue, to deploy another manipulation tactic, but she could not find a single word to say. Mitchell stood up slowly from behind his massive mahogany desk. He had been quietly observing the entire intense confrontation from his leather chair, intentionally letting me dismantle her deep entitlement entirely on my own terms. Now, the razor-sharp corporate attorney stepped forward to finish the job. He reached into the fresh manila folder resting on his desk and pulled out a single incredibly thick stack of official legal documents. He did not hand the papers to me. He walked directly over to Chloe, towering over her, and pressed the heavy legal stack firmly against her chest until she instinctively reached up and took them with her shaking hands. Chloe looked down at the dense legal text on the papers, her face twisting in utter confusion and rising panic. She looked up at the lawyer and asked Mitchell what this meant. Mitchell spoke with his signature, terrifyingly cold legal authority. He told her it was a comprehensive, legally binding, court-ordered restraining order. He explained that a strict municipal judge had signed it first thing this morning, completely granting the rapid request based entirely on the overwhelming, undeniable audio evidence of her active participation in the criminal extortion plot at the church. Mitchell told her the terms of the court order were absolutely non-negotiable. She was legally permanently forbidden from coming within 500 feet of Harrison, his downtown logistics consulting firm, or his private suburban residence. She was strictly federally prohibited from contacting him via phone calls, text messages, social media emails, or any third-party family intermediaries. Mitchell leaned in slightly, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto her terrified, tear-stained face. He told her that this legal document was effective immediately. He warned her in a low, dangerous tone that if she ever stepped a single foot onto Harrison's property, if she ever dared to call his private phone number, or if she ever tried to approach him in any public setting, he would personally ensure the local police arrested her on the spot. He promised her he would actively push the state prosecutors to charge her as a full willing accomplice to her father's massive federal bank fraud. He told her she was incredibly lucky she was standing in a nice corporate office right now and not currently sitting in a freezing concrete holding cell right next to her disgraced criminal fiancé. Mitchell then pointed a firm, unyielding finger toward the heavy mahogany doors and told her to get out of his private office before he called the lobby security guards to physically drag her out. Chloe looked down at the heavy legal documents trembling in her hands, and then she looked back up at my incredibly calm, indifferent face. She finally realized that her fake tears, her ridiculous demands, and her endless family guilt trips held absolutely zero power over me anymore. She was completely, totally defeated. She bent down, slowly picked up her heavy designer tote bag from the floor and turned around. She walked slowly out of the bright corporate office. Her narrow shoulders slumped in total defeat, her expensive leather shoes dragging heavily across the plush carpet. She did not turn back. She did not say a single parting word. The heavy mahogany door swung shut firmly behind her with a loud click, permanently sealing her out of my life forever. I turned back to look at Mitchell. The attorney sat back down in his chair and gave me a short, highly respectful nod. The brutal, agonizing war was officially over. I had finally won. Exactly 1 month later, the chaotic noise of the downtown city, the terrified screams echoing at the church altar, and the cold, harsh threats of the corporate office felt like a distant, rapidly fading nightmare. I was completely removed from the toxic family drama. It was a beautiful, incredibly warm Friday evening. I was standing alone on the expansive, gorgeous back patio of my massive custom-built home. The summer sun was just beginning to set over the horizon, casting a rich, glowing golden light over the 2 pristine acres of green land I proudly owned. The evening air smelled wonderfully of fresh-cut grass, and the savory, mouth-watering aroma of a thick, expensive ribeye steak sizzling loudly on my high-end outdoor stainless steel grill. I was wearing comfortable dark jeans and a simple cotton shirt. I held a pair of heavy cooking tongs in my right hand and a cold, heavy crystal glass of premium aged bourbon in my left. My beautiful home was an absolute fortress of peace. The tall, solid iron security gates at the end of my long private driveway were firmly locked shut, completely keeping the chaos, the greed, and the noise of the outside world firmly at bay. The sprawling $900,000 estate stood tall, silent, and totally secure behind me, its large, clear windows perfectly reflecting the brilliant orange and purple colors of the evening sky. Every single red brick, every solid wooden beam, and every blade of green grass belonged entirely to me. I had meticulously built this beautiful sanctuary with my own blood, my own sweat, and my own relentless dedication, and I knew with absolute certainty that no one was ever going to take it away from me. I flipped the thick, juicy steak on the hot metal grill, watching the bright orange flames flare up perfectly against the meat. The quiet, comforting crackle of the fire was the absolute only sound in the peaceful evening air. I reached into my front pocket and pulled out my smartphone to quickly check the time. The bright digital screen illuminated in my hand, showing a single unread email notification from Mitchell's law firm. I unlocked the phone, opened the mail application, and tapped the message. The bold subject line simply read, "Final legal confirmation." I read the brief, highly professional text from my brilliant attorney. Mitchell informed me that my father, Richard, had officially pleaded guilty to all federal charges of wire fraud and massive document forgery in a desperate, pathetic attempt to reduce his lengthy mandatory prison sentence. Because of his rapid guilty plea, the massive federal banking investigation had concluded swiftly and decisively. Mitchell's email confirmed the ultimate final victory. The fraudulent $500,000 secondary loan had been permanently and legally expunged from my official property records by the federal courts. The massive toxic financial lien was completely erased from existence. The legal title to my beautiful home was 100% clean, perfectly clear, and firmly secured solely in my name. I felt a profound, incredibly heavy weight completely lift off my shoulders and vanish into the cool evening breeze. The final lingering dark shadow of my parents' massive betrayal was officially legally gone. I scrolled past Mitchell's email and opened my phone's digital voicemail inbox. There was a dedicated, heavily restricted folder specifically designed for blocked numbers. Inside that hidden folder sat dozens of desperate, unheard audio messages from Chloe and my mother. They had undoubtedly spent the last 30 days frantically weeping into the phone, begging for money, pleading for a free place to stay, and desperately trying to drag me back into the miserable, ruined ashes of their destroyed lives. I did not listen to a single second of their toxic voices. I did not care where they were living, how they were surviving, or what they were doing. They were complete and total strangers to me now. I pressed the Select All button on the top corner of the digital screen. A small red warning prompt popped up asking me to confirm the absolute permanent deletion of the blocked audio files. I pressed the confirm button without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. The screen cleared instantly. The digital trash was completely emptied. I slid the smartphone back into my pocket, the device feeling incredibly light. I turned my attention back to the hot smoking grill, taking the perfectly cooked steak off the heat and placing it gently onto a clean ceramic plate. I picked up my heavy crystal glass and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the cold premium bourbon. The rich, smooth amber liquid burned perfectly and warmly down my throat. I stood on my beautiful stone patio and looked out over the vast, quiet expanse of my secure property. The sky was turning a deep, peaceful shade of twilight blue. There were no loud demands. There were no manipulative fake tears. There were no looming threats of federal financial ruin. There was only the quiet, incredibly beautiful life I had fought so incredibly hard to build and protect. I took a deep, refreshing breath of the cool evening air, feeling absolutely entirely at peace. I was finally, completely my own man.